If you're in the market for a gaming PC, but you don't want to build it yourself, there are tons of options out there. One of the most popular is Alienware, which is Dell's gaming arm. Today we're going to take a look at the Aurora R16. I'm Ben Funk, and you're watching Hot Hardware. The Alienware Aurora R16 we're looking at today has an Intel Core i7-13700F processor with 8 performance cores with hyper-threading and 8 efficiency cores for a total of 24 hardware threads. It has a maximum boost speed of 5.2 GHz and a 65-watt TDP. The system has 32 GB of DDR5 5600 memory in dual channel mode, an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 4070 graphics card with 12 GB of GDDR6, and a pair of 1 TB NVMe solid-state drives in the M.2 2280 form factor. The motherboard for our system has an Intel Z690 chipset, which supports overclocking, but the CPU is locked, so there are no OC options available. Once we take the side off the case, we can see the internals, which are easily accessible. The Core i7 CPU lives under our system's AIO liquid coolers pump. Next to that are 2 DIMM slots for DDR5 memory, a pair of M.2 slots for storage, and the Wi-Fi card's M.2 slot. Below that, in the single PCI Express X16 slot, is the GeForce RTX 4070 graphics card. It's powered by a standard 8-pin PCI Express connector from the power supply, which sits below it. It does have some modular power cables, and there's also a 3.5-inch SATA drive bay for mass storage. Up top, we can see the 240mm radiator with a pair of 120mm exhaust fans that vent warm air out the top of the system. There's a 120mm rear exhaust fan, and if we move the camera, we can spy the ducted front 120mm fan as well. The system also supports Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5 through the Intel AX210 chipset. The Aurora R16's enclosure uses Alienware's new Legend 3 design language, which removes the curved edges and rounded appearance in favor of a more understated design in basalt black. There are still plenty of RGB elements around the front left ring on the case, also found on the rear exhaust fan. It's less flashy than previous models like the Aurora R15, and also reduces the footprint a bit without compromising the internal expandability of the system. On the front of the system, we can see the Alienware logo, which has additional RGB LEDs and acts as the power button. Below that, we see recessed ports, a combination headset jack, 3 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports, one of which has high power delivery, and a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port with 10 gigabits per second. On the rear of the system, for ports, we have digital and analog surround sound outputs, along with a microphone jack. A total of 4 USB 2.0 ports, 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1 ports, a pair of USB 3.1 Gen 2 ports, and one of those is a 2x2 port that supplies 20 gigabits of bandwidth. There's also an RJ45 Ethernet jack as well. Below that are 2 posts for the included Wi-Fi antenna. Underneath the rear panel, we can see the video ports for the GeForce RTX 4070, 1 HDMI 2.1 and 3 DisplayPort 1.4. Under that sits the 500-watt platinum-rated power supply. Alienware also provided the AW420K mechanical keyboard with Cherry MX Red switches and the AW620M wireless gaming mouse, which has a rechargeable battery and USB receiver. These are not included with the system, but do represent serious upgrades from the stock keyboard and mouse. The Alienware Command Center application allows us to control all the RGB functionality of the system, as well as monitor temperatures and make manual adjustments to fan speeds. In the Command Center's Alien FX section, we can adjust the chassis, keyboard, and mouse either together with linked RGB effects, or separately to customize the look. Now let's take a look at some benchmarks. The Atto disk benchmark shows that the PCI Express solid-state drive can deliver read speeds up 6.5 gigabytes per second, and writes aren't terribly far behind it. Next up is Speedometer 2.0, available from browserbench.org. Scores in this benchmark are an indicator of performance users should see when browsing the web and running advanced web apps using a large array of JavaScript frameworks. We tested using the latest version of Microsoft's Edge browser, which is based on Chromium. With a score of over 390 runs per minute, browsing the web is fast and responsive. Cinebench is a rendering performance test based on Maxon Cinema 4D. This is a multi-threaded, multiprocessor-aware benchmark that renders a 3D scene and tracks the length of the entire process. You can see comparisons in our written review on hothardware.com, but we can tell you here that the Aurora scores roughly on par with our test bed, which has a Core i5-13600K, a 125-watt processor. So despite the lower TDP, the Aurora can keep up with hot clock CPUs. Next, we'll start looking at 3D graphics performance, starting with 3D Mark from UL. TimeSpy is a DirectX 12 Ultimate test, and you can see here that it runs smoothly. With a score of over 17,000, this system keeps up with the vast majority of systems that have GeForce RTX 4070 graphics cards in UL's database. You can also see the full results on Hot Hardware. Port Royal puts NVIDIA's ray tracing hardware to good use. With a score of nearly 11,000, it keeps up with other similar systems in UL's database. Tests are fun, but let's get to the real games, starting with Forza Horizon 5. We tested the game with a UHD resolution and maximum settings, and here you can see the frame rate is well up over 80 frames per second. Next up is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, which uses DXR. Ray tracing is pretty intensive, so we also enabled DLSS in this video. When we tested without DLSS, the frame rate dropped below 60. However, with DLSS set at quality, we had a really good experience even at 4K. F122 also uses hardware-accelerated ray tracing, and at 4K it's pretty smooth, but we did again require DLSS. Spider-Man Remastered does have ray-traced reflections, but we didn't need DLSS or FSR in order to keep the frame rates playable. Here you can see at 4K, maximum settings, and no upscaling that is extremely smooth. Frame rates stayed north of 80 frames per second for the majority of our test. The first big 2023 release that we're going to look at is Diablo 4. Here you can see again at 4K with maximum settings that the frame rate stays really close to 90 frames per second. It's extremely smooth even at the toughest settings. Street Fighter 6 does support frame rates higher than 60, but only in the menus and replays. During a match, the frame rate is locked at 60, even at 4K with maximum settings. Baldur's Gate 3 just recently released, and here you can see once again that at 4K with maximum settings, there are no problems running this game. Frame rates stay well north of 60 FPS the whole time. Cyberpunk 2077 came out actually in 2020, but the new RT Overdrive mode launched this year and the version 2.0 update just came out. Here we're again running at 4K, but this time we had to turn on DLSS. The RT Overdrive setting is just too much for the GeForce RTX 4070 to handle natively, but that's true of a lot of graphics cards, there's no shame in that. It still runs really smoothly. When we look at acoustic performance of the Aurora, we can see that it's actually very quiet at idle. Our sound meter is just a couple of inches from the honeycomb-shaped vents, and it doesn't even register 40 decibels. To bring the Aurora to its knees, we used a combination of Cinebench and 3D Mark Speedway, both running in a loop. It's still relatively quiet because at 12 inches from the system, we only measured about 45 decibels. When we get right up on the vents, it gets up over 50. That's still pretty quiet considering the load that we're putting on the Aurora. Alright, now that we've seen all there is to see with the Aurora R16, what do we think? Honestly, it's a really good gaming PC for somebody who doesn't want to build their own desktop. There's a little bit of a drawback in that it uses some proprietary parts. The motherboard and the power supply are not standard equipment, and so if you want to repair it later down the road, you'll need to get those replacement parts directly from Alienware and from Dell. However, everything else is standard. The CPU, obviously, the memory, the solid state drives, even the graphics card itself, those are all standard components, which means you should be able to upgrade the system later on if you want to. Gaming performance was really good. The GeForce RTX 4070 can handle just about everything, even at 4K with the highest details. On the most demanding titles like Cyberpunk, we found that we needed DLSS, and that's honestly not a big deal. Ray tracing is just really intensive, and the RT overdrive mode in Cyberpunk is especially really hard to run. So needing DLSS there is no shame on the system for that at all. The processor, even though it's a 65 watt Core i7 13700F, it does a really great job, especially with single threaded and lightly threaded tasks. It also can pull its own weight when it comes to heavily multi-threaded performance. The system is just really well balanced. So let's talk about pricing. The Aurora R16 starts at $1299. That doesn't get you our test config, but that's where it starts, and that's a pretty affordable price. And honestly, for what you get here, the asking price of our review unit is about $1950. And that's a Core i7 13700F, a GeForce RTX 4070, 32 gigabytes of DDR5 5600, two 1 terabyte SSDs, the clear side panel, the closed loop liquid cooler, lots of RGB effects. It is just the tower. It does not include the keyboard or mouse that we showed earlier. But for $2,000, you're doing pretty great. We recommend it for anybody who does not want to build their PCs themselves. So that about wraps it up. This is the Aurora R16. I have been Ben, and you've been watching Hot Hardware.